Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. My name is Javier Guzman, and I'm the Director of the Global Health Policy Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. And I'm very excited today to co-host this webinar with the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. The webinar will be on the progress and challenges in the transparent deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. We all know that we heard a lot of calls for transparency in the past in regards to the global deployment of COVID-19 vaccines, and we haven't seen little progress. But we are very excited to talk today about the progress that has been made. We have seen the UNICEF's COVID-19 vaccine dashboard that was launched in 2020 in December. We also were very excited to see the task force releasing a central repository of key data in June 2021. Some governments have released a few contracts, and we know that every little helps. However, we see how there is still an overwhelmingly lack of information on some aspects of the deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. We strongly believe that transparency strengthens the global and the national decision-making and the global and national response. And of course, we will have a more efficient, equitable, effective vaccine rollout if there is transparency. We will talk about transparency not just in regards to price and volumes, but also manufacturing capacity, purchase orders, delivery times, donations, and everything else. So with that, let me just ask Arne Strand, Director of the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Centers, to give his remarks. And welcome again. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Arne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I'd like to start just by reminding ourselves that it's now almost 2 years since the first COVID-19 case was identified in Wuhan in China. Since then, more than 5 million people have died, and figures tell that it's almost 250 million people that have been infected. It's unprecedented in a sense of the scale and also how quickly this has happened. But not only that, the pandemic has exposed weaknesses in health system, especially the lack of integrity, transparency, and accountability. Overall, we have seen that mechanisms for minimizing corruption in the health sector, particularly in the pandemic preparedness and response, are inadequate. At U4, we, as in other things we do, we believe that sustainable and inclusive development, and indeed the pandemic response and recovery, starts where corruption ends. And unless we address transparency, accountability, and integrity issue, this pandemic is likely to drag on. We can even see new variants emerging, and we can really, it's untold the cost this might bring. There might be breakdown of health systems internationally, even if we in the North seems to be coping with it now. And there might be more of an economic collapse, and not least of likelihood, if the pandemic is not contained. It's been therefore very high on our agenda to address the corruption in the COVID-19 response. Last 2 years, we have worked, and the team has worked really hard to provide partners in the general public with evidence-based policy advice, training, and not least cutting-edge research on how to enhance transparency and accountability. We were then lucky when we in 2020 received an additional grant from NORAD, the Norwegian Development Agency, to deepen our work on health sector corruption and to support CACHA, which is the Coalition on Accountability, Transparency, and Anti-Corruption in Health System, which is composed of WHO, the Global Fund, the World Bank Group, and the UNDP as a knowledge partner. The grant from NORAD also made it possible for this current study on how opacity and secrecy in the COVID-19 vaccine value chain affects universal equal access. The conclusion is that we need urgent action by the international community, and particularly the high-income countries and main vaccine funders and buyers, to address the secrecy problem and its implication for vaccine access. Enough being said, I like to hand over the word to Karen Hussmann, our expert that has worked on this issue. You are much better positioned than me to go deeply into it and to present the finding. Thanks, Karen, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Arne. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And above all, thank you very much to CGD and to you4 to give me the chance to speak about this issue, which actually has moved me pretty much from the beginning of this year and has become a sort of a little obsession to try to identify how transparency plays a role in order to allow for universal and more equal access to the vaccines. I will try to share my screen. Hold on a second. Okay, so what has already been said is that the vaccine actually offer a way out of the pandemic, and that can be seen in many of the countries that have relatively high vaccination rates already. But the secrecy throughout the international value chain actually causes poorer countries to lose out, not only in terms of health outcomes, but also in terms of governance, also democracy. We have seen social unrest related to the economic, to increased economic problems. And also poorer countries take much longer, according to predictions and studies of renowned international organizations, to recover from the pandemic later on. So what is the role that transparency plays and where the secrecy at the moment is still something to address? I would like to carry through the analysis of the current situation and starting with transparency or the lack thereof in research and development. Massive amounts of public investment have played a crucial role in the development of record speed COVID-19 vaccines. And the numbers available vary widely depending on the sources used. And they range from everything but from 51 to 88 billion euros when taking grants, credits, and advanced purchasing agreements together. This public investment has essentially removed or lowered industry risk, and there's absolutely no doubt that it is necessary. What is striking is that there is little public information about who has funded what, to what amount, and with which, for what organization, and what conditions may be attached or not attached as yet. So, for example, what I found striking was an example that the University of Oxford, in its very initial days, had stated that if its vaccine was successful, that it would make it publicly available as a public global good, and in order for the world to be able to produce the vaccine. But then when Oxford University entered an agreement with the AstraZeneca for scaling up and production of the vaccine, this commitment was not longer there. And from my knowledge, there has been very little public debate on this change of approach, which raises a question, and not only for this case, but it raises a bigger question as to whether public funders may have missed opportunities to establish certain conditions for later on in the vaccine stage, to develop or to have certain conditions for production, in particular in view of the long alerted supply scarcity, which is a lesson that is important to look into for the future. So full information on research and development on funding and its conditions is needed to inform open debate about vaccine production. And that brings me to the next point of the value chain. That is the approach that I've taken to analyze the different issues of transparency. With regard to manufacturing, we are in a situation where the demand for vaccines far outstrips supply. That is something that we all know already. And we are in a seller's market where a few companies face challenges to scale up production in order to meet the tremendous demand internationally. And then there have been different options that have been relatively hotly debated over the past months, including patent waivers, technology transfer mechanisms, public licensing, and other mechanisms. And while all options have their own political economy and the interests of all involved, it is again striking that major public funders, to some extent, or in a number of ways, have either not supported or blocked some of these options. And these countries or international organizations include Germany, also EU, and the United States has only in May changed its position on these issues. And this despite their global commitment to help end the pandemic, when they signed up to the historic commitment in May last year to all work together in order to address the pandemic. And despite indications that from experts that there is manufacturing capacity that could be scaled up or that could be established in countries in the global south, including countries like South Africa, India, Argentina, Brazil, and quite a number of others. This shows the tensions that there are between the different interests and an apparent policy incoherence between, on the one hand, commercial and trade interests, possibly geopolitical interests of the countries, versus their commitments with development goals and the commitment to ending the pandemic. And what is in this, I'm not going to enter into the different aspects of all of these different options. There are many experts that are addressing these. But what I consider to be really crucial is that there is information available in order to inform these debates about the role public investment has played in the research and development of the different vaccines. And so that the countries actually and the public have an understanding of what this role was, and so that the public funders can use this information on the amounts of funding and their conditions as in order to leverage and or to identify levers that inform the decisions on the different policy options that are available. In terms of distribution is probably at the moment one of the most burning issues. Because when we look at the international distribution, the wealthiest nations are in a position to vaccinate some of the countries, to vaccinate their population several times over, and low and middle income countries have had little access. This is shown or illustrated by the fact that 45% of the world population has had one dose by the end of September of this year, which is reflected in vaccination rates in the countries of between 77 or 70% in the richer countries, and around 3 to 5 or 7% in the low and lower middle income countries. One of the major reasons for this discrepancy is that bilateral deals between governments and companies have undermined COVAX, and this is reflected in a number, for example, also by the end of September, that of the about 6 billion doses delivered worldwide, only 300 million have been delivered by COVAX. This is about only 5%. So there's a question then, what has happened with COVAX as an unprecedented mechanism, which needs to be congratulated, but there's a question as to whether it has been allowed to, I would say, even to fail, or at least not to fulfill its role. And then there's a really big question as to why this has been the case, how this has happened, and what can be done at this point of time and potentially in the future. In terms of why these bilateral agreements have dominated so much, I think it needs to be recognized that there's a legitimate interest of all countries to first cater to the needs of their own population. But at the same time, we need to recall that most of the countries that have too many doses, far too many doses at the moment, have signed up to the pledge for a global solution. So we are standing in front of a collective action problem where short-sighted and short-term country-level solutions are prioritized over more long-term equitable distribution, and also allowing to lead to the dangerous mutations, and probably there are more to come. Ironically, some of the countries that are accused of vaccine hoarding are also the main funders of COVAX, and those include the US, the UK, Canada, and some other countries. Now, recently, the G7 has, the group of G7 has pledged to donate large amounts of doses. And donations are welcome in the current situation, there's no doubt about that. But there's an issue of to what extent the existing excess doses, for example, that are destined for donations can be used, because there are contractual limitations in quite a number of cases for countries to sell on or to donate the excess doses, which is related to the contractual arrangements that were made between governments and the pharma industry. And most of these clauses are not known to the public. And we are coming to the secrecy in contracting. So there's a tremendous lack of transparency, which would allow for the counterbalancing measures to address inequity, which hopefully is possible to be addressed in the future. And then there's a second problem related to the donations of vaccines, which is a lack of information of which country donates how many doses to which other country and through which mechanism. And then what does that mean in terms of addressing actually the inequity and on what criteria this is going to be based? And at the same time, it also allows for certain, at least public doubts to generate some so-called vaccine diplomacy when it's not clear for what reasons donations are given to a certain country. And that has happened when countries that have sufficient, or that not sufficient, but which have a number that have relatively high rates of vaccination through bilateral contracts, at the same time are donated or are receiving quite a number of donations as well. So altogether, the lack of easily accessible public information on vaccine delivery to the countries, whether delivered through contracts or donations, has hindered so far a global overview of the gross mismatch between supply and demand, and to take the appropriate balancing countermeasures. Javier has already mentioned the task force, the joint COVID-19 task force, which is certainly a step in the right direction. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion later on, whether or not these problems that I'm mentioning at the moment are already being addressed, and whether it's possible to address them, and how it's possible to improve. With regard to vaccine contracts, it has been in the public debate over the last months that there is a relatively great amount of secrecy around the vaccine contracts. And that has already been levied by different actors into the public debate. TI Global Health Program and Transparencia Mexicana have conducted some excellent research in this regard. And Transparency International Health, for example, has found that in March, 183 contracts were public, and of those, only 183 contracts were available, but only 13 contracts had been public, and 2 of them had been even leaked. And most of these contracts have been more redacted than normal, that contracts of normal vaccines under normal circumstances, which also raises a question. Transparencia Mexicana has more recently analyzed 37 contracts from 14 countries, plus the EU, and found that more than 80% of the contracts did not publish the value or the delivery schedules of the vaccines. And I would really like to focus for this purpose, or this webinar, on the delivery schedules, because not knowing the delivery schedules makes it very, very complicated to know which vaccines are supposed to arrive at which place when. So with regard to the vaccine contracts, information requests are often denied on grounds of commercial confidentiality or even national security. And governments fear that they will jeopardize future deals with pharma firms if they make contracts public. And this does not only stand in stark contrast to the commitments of many of the countries with open contracting and open government, not allowing public scrutiny, but actually nobody knows how many vaccines are supposed to reach which country at what time and with which price, and also with which condition. And there we come back again to the issue of the donations. If countries have legitimate reasons to enter into deals with a number of companies to have sufficient supply for their countries, then it's absolutely necessary to have public information of what the conditions are under which these excess vaccines can be sold on or donated. And most importantly, all of this really includes or hinders the fair and universal access to the direly needed vaccines in poorer and lower middle income countries. So as Javier already said, the international community must act, and it must take more steps to lift the different waves of opacity that we are facing at the moment in the international dimensions of the COVID-19 value chain. Now, what could be done? First of all, in the part on research and development, governments, the EU and COVAX should definitely publish and how much money they give to whom. If research institute, biotech firm, university, or pharma company, under which mechanism, whether through credits, grants, or advanced purchasing agreements or others, and for what, whether it's for the research itself, for the clinical trials, for manufacturing capacity, and other parts of the development process. And this should ideally be linked to an international registry so that it's easy for policymakers and other interested actors to follow up on what money has been given to whom under what condition. And this would also allow to have an open debate, which is needed, whether or not this funding should be attached to some conditions, and if so, which ones, because there is, I think, a recognition that public global interest should prevail in conditions of a pandemic. In terms of manufacturing, governments and pharma companies should publish their positions and arguments for the different options to scale up production. There are, as I said, there are legitimate interests on all sides, but they need to be known and they need to be fundamented by evidence-based data and their own positions and arguments, so that transparent and informed policy choices can actually be made and also be transmitted to the public. This has an important impact also on the trust internationally on vaccines and on the rollout of vaccine campaigns. And while each actor has legitimate interests, as I said, lobby activities on the one hand should be registered and scrutinizable, and there is a need to increase transparency in that respect. And on the other hand, the largest vaccine funders and largest WHO and ODA donors should address their policy coherence, which I mentioned before, between the commercial and trade interests versus developmental commitments. And with regard to distribution, I think one of the really important steps internationally would be an international clearinghouse of information that provides a full set of data, of open data, on the access of countries to vaccines. And there's already a step into the right direction with regard to the COVID-19 task force, which actually gathers or integrates quite a number of the efforts that Javier had mentioned before. But from my understanding, it's not yet complete in terms of having information on the doses promised and doses delivered through contracts or donations by each country, so that there's a link between of this information. The delivery schedules attached for both of that, both also again for vaccines delivered through contractual arrangements or donations, and the prices paid. And this clearinghouse of information would allow to take the counterbalancing measures that are needed in order to weigh or to address the existing inequities. In terms of public contracting, governments, the EU and COVAX should definitely publish their contracts, and with the absolute minimum of redactions. And actually, CGD has an interesting offer of the principles for transparency in commercial contracts that could guide the establishment of standards in that regard. And in particular, this information should include, as I said before, the number of doses, the delivery schedules, in order for on an international level to be able to foresee where we will have excess doses, where we will have insufficient doses, and thus internationally take measures to counterbalance these inequities. And ideally, these websites or the national websites that nurture an international clearinghouse should all be linked up, so that it's easy to have at international level the possibility to follow the development, as well as at national level to do the scrutiny that is needed by national actors to generate public trust. And with regard to donors, the donors have a number of donors, international organizations have a number of issues that they could and hopefully should support, I would put particular emphasis on the promotion of transparency in all the functions and processes of COVAX. I think that COVAX unfortunately has followed pretty much the same patterns as bilateral or national governments and the EU in terms of secrecy, in particular for the contracts, but also in terms of the spending in research and development through CEPI. And donors and international organizations should foster lessons learned and critical review of what has happened so far with COVAX, as I mentioned before. There's some of information or some initiatives in that respect are already underway. And I think it's really important to understand what has happened with this absolutely important mechanism that unfortunately has not been able or has not been allowed to function according to the initial expectations. And finally, donors, international organizations should support the development of minimum standards for transparency in vaccine development for pandemics. I think that pandemics are a very specific situation which doesn't and should not respond to where the decisions taken by governments and public funders and international organizations in particular. And also I would hope that the private sector would also see that as a very specific situation where decisions need to be taken in the interests where in a way that the public interest prevails, national interests, commercial interests, or trade interests. And in that, for all of this, in order to have an informed debate on that, it's absolutely necessary to have much more public information, to have better and informed debates. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak to this issue. I think it's really important also to look at the different linkages between the four areas of the value chain and how all of them fall together and create certain path dependence when particular decisions are taken at the beginning of the value chain, and then how that resonates and is reflected at the later stages of the value chain. And in that sense, again, my appeal for ensuring that transparency and access to information is guaranteed, and that public funders, and in particular the countries that are the most important public funders, take a lead role in this. And those include the US, the EU, Germany, Switzerland, and a number of other countries that should, and I think also Norway, and we will hear from Norway, to take the lead and show in which way steps can be taken to increase public access to information. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that comprehensive overview, for that great landscape. We're going to get into the panel. We have 4 great panelists who are going to give us their insights into, where we are, what we can do, and the way forward. But before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say that we are basically getting questions from the audience. So if you have any question, please submit the question to events@cgdev.org or tweet at CGDev using the hashtag CGD Talks, or you can also submit your comments or questions via YouTube. So now let's introduce the panelists. We have 4 panelists, as I said. First one, we have Priya Basu, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force on COVID-19, and he works at the World Bank. Second, we have Eduardo Boorques. He is the Executive Director of the Transparency International Group in Mexico. We have Paul Richard Fife. He's the Director of the Department for Human Development at the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. And last but not least, we have my colleague, Charles Kinney, who is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. So we're going to have a general question for our panelists, and then we get into some more specific questions for each of them. So the first general question I have after hearing Karen and after understanding where we are is, there's a lot of need for more transparency, and we see the continuum. We see transparency needed from research and development really upstream to distribution, contracting, really downstream. And it is difficult to, have it all at this point in time. So What are the key, the biggest opportunities, the biggest gaps in terms of transparency at this point in time in the pandemic response? We've heard about how a lot of the pre-purchase orders and the donations have not been delivered. We heard about, swaps, and new innovative ways of increasing supply, stockpiles that might be about to expire, countries and health systems that need to get ready. So what are the gaps and the biggest opportunities? Priya, could you please get started? Over to you.
Thank you, Javier, and hello everyone, and thank you CGDev for organizing this this meeting. So maybe if you'll allow me, I'll just give you a little bit about the Multilateral Leaders Task Force before I jump into the question you've asked. So the Multilateral Leaders Task Force was established earlier this year in late June in response to calls from the G7, G20, and others. It was convened by the World Bank jointly with the IMF, the WHO, and the World Trade Organization, and it's led by the heads of the 4 organizations. So it really brings together the collective heft of these 4 organizations, and the goal is to accelerate access to COVID-19 vaccines, but also other critical medical countermeasures, with a particular focus on low-income countries and low and middle-income countries. We've set very ambitious targets of vaccinating 40% of people in all countries by the end of this year, and then there's a 70% vaccination target by mid-2022. And one of the key areas of focus of the MLT, as we call it, has been to use data to drive action for transparent, equitable rollout of vaccines, starting with vaccines, and then there's also a focus, as I mentioned, on therapeutics and diagnostics. And one of the first steps we took was to establish a website that includes a data dashboard that's publicly available. It was launched, the beta version, as we call it, was launched just 1 month after the MLT was formed. And what we started doing was to compile, track, and monitor key indicators on vaccine needs, on vaccine supplies, on vaccine delivery, on deployment, what we call shots in arms, on dose donations, on the financing gaps. So if you think of the continuum sort of from the signing of contracts on paper to the delivery of vaccines to ports and airports to the deployment of vaccines into people's arms. So that kind of entire chain, we started to collect data, and we collected it from various sources that have already been mentioned. There's been a number of efforts that the UNICEF Vaccine Market Dashboard, the WHO Vaccine Tracker and Landscape, the IMF has a repository of information on supply, the Duke Global Health Initiative, Affinity, etc. So, the goal was to not duplicate what others are doing, but to put everything together and to create a sort of one-stop shop. Phase 2 will be to build. So this is, there are still gaps, and we're continuing to build on the production side, on trade, and also more on therapeutics and diagnostics. And we're working with a variety of partners. And this, by the way, it's a global database. It includes data for 186 countries. It shows the data both globally, but also country by country. There are country dashboards. So the goal is to use data as a driver of action to mobilize support to fill critical gaps in vaccine supply, delivery, and deployment. Just as an example, how are we using this data to support faster and more targeted solutions? So our data shows, and Karen mentioned this as well, that wealthier countries have secured doses far in excess of what they need to vaccinate their populations, in some cases 8 times as many doses as needed. At the same time, there are billions of doses that are forecast to be produced in the remainder of this year. But what we find from our data is that poorer countries are finding themselves at the back of the vaccine delivery queue. Many of them have secured doses, but they're not receiving these doses because their deliveries are going to come kind of late in 2022. So then we've used this information to try to advocate for change, creative solutions, for example, swaps, queue swapping. So countries that have sufficient number of doses now to vaccinate their populations, and where they're seeing high vaccination rates, we're asking them to switch places in line and accept later delivery dates so that vaccinations can be delivered, so that vaccines can be delivered to the countries that need them the most. And in this context, I'd like to say that the recent deal between US government, Moderna, and the African Union is an example of this kind of a swap to make 110 million doses available for Africa, with delivery starting in fourth quarter of 2021. So we would really like to see more of these kinds of swaps. We're also tracking those donations very carefully. That was also mentioned by Karen. And then using that data to advocate for faster delivery of pledges. So about 1.3 billion doses have been pledged by wealthier countries, but the last I saw, only 22% of those doses had actually been delivered, and only about 11.5% had been delivered to developing countries. So how can we get faster action on that? So now coming to gaps. Now there's a whole range of gaps, but I think we need to prioritize. Right now, our main target, our main goal should be to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible in developing countries. The goal is 40%, as I said, by the end of this calendar year. What do we need for that? So the big gap there, and this was also mentioned, but I just want to kind of highlight it again. The big gap, as we see now on the data side, is more visibility on dose delivery plans and schedules. So this visibility needs to come, this data needs to come both from vaccine manufacturers as well as from countries that are donating doses. We need to have information on order quantities, on the types of doses, on the expiry dates of those doses, and we need that information with details on destination. Where are these going? What are the shipment dates? What are the arrival dates? And this we find is, this is really a critical part of helping countries get prepared for deployment as well, because as we see supplies are forecast to start increasing, and with all the action that we're taking and the measures that we're using to get more supplies into developing countries, the other side of the coin really is to prepare these countries to get those doses from ports and airports into people's arms. And if we don't have this information if we don't have transparency on delivery, then we're not going to be able to prepare countries for deployment. So that I see, there's lots of gaps, and many of them have been mentioned and articulated very well by Karen. But I think the single most important gap right now to get shots in people's arms is more transparency around these schedules. Thanks.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you for introducing the task force and for giving us your opinion on where the biggest gap is. Eduardo, do you want to comment on, from your point of view, what are the biggest gaps in terms of transparency at this point in time? Over to you.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you everyone for the opportunity of joining this panel. Just like Priya did, I have to inform that I'm obviously the Executive Director of Transparency International in Mexico, but I also are part of a global task force on vaccines and treatments from Transparency International. So most of the comments I'm gonna refer or make are based on the experience globally and not only from Mexico. And that will be very important for the panel to know. I think Priya has made a fantastic point. The point of using data for driving action and how important is data for efficiency, for reducing gaps and other issues, and most of it should be transparent. I think we will agree on that. It will enhance the quality of the markets and a lot of local decisions that could be made. So I think we are in the right path when we're talking about disclosing data in the right formats, making it available not only for governments, but also to communities and interested parties so we can make the most out of decisions. At this point, Javier, I think we have talked, as you said, at the early part of this panel, we have talked a lot about the levels of transparency and opacity in contracting and other issues. Karen did a fantastic review jointly with the U4, but I think we should start talking very rapidly about the transition from a supply side market to a demand side market and the levels of transparency that should be presented when the governments start conducting procurement in the traditional way, no? When they have to collect the data from their own communities and societies, and they start doing procurement in the traditional way. On Transparencia Mexicana side, on TI Mexico, we have already started thinking in the necessary standards of information for contracts to secure this transition from, again, a supply-driven market to a demand-driven market. So we have to be prepared. And in advance to this, to present and promote the adoption of transparency standards for the data associated at least with contracting. I know that Karen and Priya have talked about the whole cycle, and I understand that, but we are focusing at least in contracting, in public procurement, and we should be able to disclose or to present this information standard very soon, because certain countries, as Priya has very clearly suggested and expressed, some countries are ready for moving to the next phase in terms of procurement. So we should address the levels of transparency in procurement for these governments that are ready. Mexico probably is one of them. And in the next months, we are going to be starting to see the first procurement processes associated with COVID, which obviously are not only related to the vaccine, but for treatments and other important things associated with distribution. The other point I want to share from our experience, our local and international experience, is that we should definitely start making distinctions between transparency, integrity, and corruption. They all seem the same, but these are very different conceptual issues that we should address. We are talking right now about transparency, but it means nothing about integrity. No? You could be very transparent and very cynical. We have discovered that in the past decade, no? Or so. No? You can have all the information on a website, and that doesn't mean that you are conducting properly and with integrity, for instance, a procurement process. No? So we need to start talking about these conceptual distinctions. One thing is corruption, other thing is integrity. Corporate integrity is also very relevant. We have conducted an analysis of the levels of integrity of the companies that are supplying the vaccines. We are going to be presenting it in the next month or so, and you're going to discover that the levels of corporate integrity in companies vary a lot from one vaccine to the next one. So we need to start talking conceptually in different probably parallel or complementary routes. One is transparency, the other one is integrity, corporate integrity as a whole dimension, and then corruption risks and cases to learn from. And when I was listening to Priya, I was really wondering if we are systematizing all the corruption scandals, no, that are associated, because that's very powerful data, no? To know how corruption occurred and then try to prevent it in the next future. Finally, I think another important issue is that we have been focusing a lot, as Karen and Priya were suggesting, in the vaccine itself, but contracting and public expenditure goes to the whole cycle, no? Not only to research and development, Karen, but to distribution, to the use of the military forces to distribute vaccines. That represents a lot of costs and public expenditure that should also be addressed. So I think we need to, my point, Javier, is that we need to start the transition now. We need to be prepared for the next year now. And I think it's absolutely necessary that our conversations evolve from the postmortem, no, which is right now what we are doing. No, we are always assessing what happened in the past 2 years, to trying to place ourselves in the next and immediate future and secure that the transition between these markets that now are driven by companies and by the supply side, we secure that when we are moving country by country to the demand side, we're really prepared in terms of integrity, transparency, corporate integrity, and obviously having the necessary anti-corruption measures to prevent corruption to occur in several countries, Javier.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you for asking us to think about the next phase of the pandemic, where we will have more available supply and we will have more bilateral deals. I want to bring Paul because not just to talk about the gaps, which is basically the general question, but we also heard the big role high-income countries should play in, starting, this movement of transparency and having the levers to, be able to be the first to disclose information. Can you comment on both, on the gaps and also on the role of high-income countries and what the Norwegians have done, or what the advice for other high-income countries could be? Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Javier. I mean, it's great being here, and I really commend you for and CGD for putting transparency at the core of equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. And I think that Karen's reports that we will be studying and look into really shows that several of the issues we're discussing as part of the value chain are interconnected. So to the first question goes in terms of right now, this moment in the pandemic, what should we focus on as a global community? And I agree both with Priya and with Karen that it is around, shall we say, distribution and vaccine delivery. We know that supplies is basically ramping up, and clearly there's a big need for higher transparency, visibility, advanced notification of deliveries, including of donations in countries. So I mean, it's clear that both in terms of arrival dates and so on, but for countries, in particular low-income countries, to be able to prepare for quite large operations and not impact on other services, basically it is really essential, shall we say, to have that kind of information systematized and shall we say, spending, using, distributing the available vaccine as effectively and equitably as possible. So I do think, I mean, from our side, we think that COVAX is really doing very good, but COVAX is only part, a quite small part of the broader global picture. So I mean, Priya, it's really good to hear about the task force and basically the ambitions. And I think, for instance, one of the recommendations in the reporting count report, I mean, to really look into, shall we say, this clearinghouse for information. Is really important, shall we say, to move forward on at this stage of the pandemic. At the same time, it's clear I don't want to just look at this as one piece, shall we say, of the bottlenecks of the puzzle. I do think that also the report is good, basically laying out several of the different parts of the value chain. So in terms of high-income countries, what could they do? First of all, it's very clear that, I mean, looking into consideration the policy discussions and the public debates going in countries, high-income countries ought really to take into account the global situation, in particular the needs of low-income countries, I mean, who are lagging behind in terms of coverage, as part of, shall we say, the process of developing their national policies for COVID-19 vaccination and procurement schemes. I mean, this goes straight, I mean, into the whole issue of shall we say, governments and their primary responsibility for own populations. But it's clear that there is a very strong case, both from a public health viewpoint and a human rights viewpoint, to take into account, shall we say, that kind of global considerations when addressing, shall we say, public policies in countries. The second thing, it's very clear that engaging in multilateral collaboration, seeking really for collective actions, collective solutions, is something that needs to be encouraged. And on the Norwegian government side, I mean, it's very clear that finding multilateral solutions, working together, and there are various processes ongoing, is really a key strategy. And also here, we do think that international bodies such as the WHO, shall we say, and some play a particular role in providing leadership and stewardship in these processes. And again, going back to the task force, we do think anchoring this as part of the broader, shall we say, not only the development system, but also the broader financial and socio-economical political systems is key, shall we say, to really reach the level of engagement that is needed. But also pushing the boundaries for transparency. And here clearly there are several issues at stake, but it goes, I think Eduardo raised the issue of public contracting and what we're learning and how we basically can move forward on this. And it's clear we can do more now, but it's clear that taking the learnings into, shall we say, what we know will be a next pandemic is critical. And we know that it's always easier to work together, finding collective solutions when one is not in the immediate, shall we say, crisis of the moment. So on Norway's side, just to say, very strong support of equitable access. You asked Javier, what have we been doing? I'm speaking on behalf of the development arm as a development agency. I do think some of the issues that Karen raised in terms of policy coherence, that applies in all countries. But it is important to look at the different aspects of commerce, trade, development, and so on. We've had a vigorous debate also in Parliament. And clearly this needs to be open, transparent, and also, shall we say, taking into account the democratic processes also that needs to happen in each country. But we have been co-chairing the Facilitation Council in the ACTA group. We have made sizable contributions to COVAX and CEPI. We strongly support CTAP and other type of data sharing, shall we say, mechanisms. And also earlier this year, we put forward 4 principles, shall we say, that we think are key, in terms of pushing forward on equitable access, and transparency is part of that. Fair pricing and encouraging really manufacturers to provide, shall we say, pricing at cost or close to cost to developing countries is one of the issues. And also, it might be raised as part of this discussion. We are leading the TRIPS Council now in the negotiations, and it's fair to say that we are as anxious to see the outcome of those negotiations as everyone else is. So I think I'll stop now, Javier, and I'm just again commend CGD for doing exactly what we think is needed also from high-income countries, supporting independent research and analysis, supporting civil society organizations also in country, when it comes to in-country dynamics, and really putting up for serious and vigorous debate amongst the public and practitioners.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for giving us the Norwegian perspective. Charles, you've been working on contracting, and you had the working group with the private sector. What do you think about what are the potential levers to open up these COVID-19 contracts, or how do you think we can get the data that we are basically asking for in terms of the delivery schedules and the delivery plans? Is there any way to improve that? Over to you, Charles.
Thanks. Just to come in on your first question briefly, I've agreed with what everybody else has said. I would sort of emphasize 2 things. One is, I think at the moment we really need the G20 to say, here's what doses we have, and here is when they are going to expire. And the reason for that is I think it will be a moment to force action when they publish the fact that they're sitting on a whole load of vaccines that are going to expire pretty soon, and it is clear they will never use. It should lead to moral outrage. I hope it will lead to moral outrage, and I think that would be a forcing moment to get these vaccines where they can be much better used rather than thrown out. But coming to where they can be much better used, this is the largest, most rapid vaccination effort ever in history, right? Smallpox took us sort of 150 years. Many countries never got to 70% vaccination coverage rates before we got rid of it. Flu vaccination every year, we managed to get, 15% of the planet vaccinated, I think. This is unprecedented. And At the moment, the really important thing we need to know is once those vaccines get to countries that have some of the weakest distribution systems, are those distribution systems ready to get them from the airport into people's arms, in rural areas and in an equitable manner to the highest impact arms possible, the oldest arms first and so on. And I think we don't know very much about that. And this isn't a question about commercial confidentiality or governments hiding information, for political reasons. A lot of this we literally just don't know. And I think there should be a huge and rapid effort to try and actually collect that data and get it into the public domain. This can't just be, collecting data that other people put together. I think it is a place where, Priya, if I may say, the World Bank can play a real role in generating new data, working with client governments on, no, come on, really, how are we going to get these vaccines from the airport into people's arms, and in particular, prioritizing that effort. And I think it's really urgent. Sorry, now, Javier, to your question on the private sector. It kind of stuns me that we are in the midst of what is probably going to be, for all its faults, for all it's been too slow and horribly inequitable, we are in the middle of what will be the fastest rollout of a global vaccine ever, which has involved, a bunch of companies playing a really important part in this. And at the moment, pretty much you ask, your average person on the street what they think of these companies, and they don't think they're heroic. I would trend in the other direction about public opinion around the likes of Pfizer and Moderna. And I think that's a real sort of misfortune for them, and actually, one that could be avoided. If you look at the reasons given for why this information isn't being published, most of them don't really suggest there's a big downside to Pfizer or Moderna or whoever publishing this information. And indeed, when we came up with this list of sort of principles around publishing contract information at CGD, one of the groups one of the people on the working group, he was representing himself, but he worked for Glaxo, and Glaxo actually, after we finished, GSK came out and said, basically we are in favor of publishing contractual information that is in the public interest to be disclosed. Now, we are talking about a bunch of information that is blindingly obviously in the public interest to be disclosed. And I think the reason that the likes of GSK would say, hey, it's kind of in our interest, is precisely because they wouldn't want to end up, and Pfizer shouldn't want to end up, and Moderna shouldn't want to end up in the situation that some of these pharmaceutical companies find themselves in, as being seen as the enemy, as being seen as the problem. Governments, I think, at the moment some people in government at the moment are in cahoots, if you will, with people in industry who haven't thought this through very much. On the government side, I think there's a sort of actually somewhat legitimate worry that if all the contracting details came out, it would be very clear that a lot of governments had paid an obscenely high price for to get front of queue and buy way too many vaccines, more than they could ever use, and that looks a bit unfortunate when usually bureaucrats are told you've got to do the efficient and lowest cost solution. We should let them off. This was a pandemic. This was an emergency. We wanted to throw money at the problem. It was absolutely the right solution. They were going to waste a load of money. We shouldn't clobber them for that. We should clobber them for the fact that they are now turning their embarrassment over that fact into this sort of collusive effort with pharmaceutical companies that I think, as I say, are making a mistake on their part, to keep information secret that is actually slowing down the response. So sort of the answer to your question is, I actually think there's a real upside to pharmaceutical companies and governments to get this information out there, as long as it's done in a way that sort of, emphasizes why choices were made and the way they were made and what was known at the time. And actually, I think it would be a role for sort of civil society, CGD included, if and when that happens, and I hope it happens soon, to say, hey, look, don't judge on what seem like really high prices and stuff. It was an emergency situation. We didn't know which vaccines were going to work. We didn't know if any were going to work. A huge amount of unknowns. It was the right moment to throw money at the problem. They threw money at the problem. Don't judge them for that. Judge them for, are they keeping shots out of people's arms? And at the moment, yes, they are, by keeping this stuff secret. If they published this stuff, they wouldn't be, and they would have been part of, what in some ways could still turn out to be, a great global victory, in that we stop, or at least we, turn this disease from a hideous pandemic into an annoying endemic in record time. And so, I still think there's that possibility, and transparency is part of the answer.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm conscious that we're coming to an end and we didn't have all the time we wanted, but I just wanted to summarize a few key highlights, I think. Well, I will actually ask you all to go back to the very nice comprehensive report Karen and you four put together. They've got very good recommendations. Also, to commend the World Bank and the task force for getting the dashboard app. I'm very interested to see the next steps. I'm very interested to see, whether we're able to get delivery schedules, whether we're able to get, the data that you mentioned, Priya. And also, we know that the bank has done a great exercise in terms of assessing countries' ability, countries' systems, but that's not published in the dashboard. So it would be nice to also have that information that already sits somewhere else there. So thank you, Paul, for your perspective on, the high-income country ability to lead the way. And thank you, Eduardo, for asking us to think about the beyond, beyond the immediate sellers market, and looking into more the longer term transparency, but also corruption and integrity issues. And Charles, thank you for highlighting the G20 and what the G20 can do now in the immediate term, and also how this is an opportunity not just for countries and companies. Thank you very much all. It's been great to have you here. Hope you enjoy and see the report, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.